Welcome, everybody, to another Image and Focus show. This is episode number 5, Understanding Autofocus. And with me, as always, is my good friend, David Swindler. How you doing, David?
I'm doing great. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. And this is part 1 of a 2-part series on autofocus. In this episode, we're going to be talking about the fundamental of autofocus systems, how autofocus systems work, and what they're all about. In the next episode, we're going to be covering more advanced topics on how to implement autofocus when you're out in the field and using it in difficult situations. Why don't we get started, David?
Absolutely. So on modern cameras, there are 2 primary autofocus systems. We have phase detection and contrast detection. Phase detection is the fastest and most accurate method. And the way it works is it can either be performed on sensor or in a separate autofocus system. And the image is going to be broken up into 2 separate images sometimes by a little prism or sometimes actually on the CMOS itself. And it's going to be broken up into 2 images, and it's going to be redirected to an AF sensor. Now that AF sensor is going to compare the 2 images, and if they line up exactly where they should, the image is in focus. But if the images are too close or further apart than where they should be, then it's out of focus, and the system is going to adjust the focus ring to bring them into alignment. And so it can be done very quickly and very accurately as well. But on a DSLR, it's going to be done through a separate autofocus system. But on these mirrorless cameras, and also on some of these newer DSLRs that are coming out, it's now being performed sometimes even in a hybrid way where you have a separate autofocus system and it's also being performed on the sensor itself. Now, if we look at a contrast detection method, it's a bit different. In that case, it's actually looking at the pixels on the sensor, and it's adjusting the focus to try to achieve the maximum contrast of that particular those pixels on the sensor. And so if you place your focus box over an area that has kind of low native contrast, this method is going to struggle because there's not enough contrast for it to determine where it achieves the maximum contrast. But instead, if you have that focus box over, like, let's say, an area where like the landscape meets the sky, well, that's going to be a very high contrast area. It's going to be able to achieve focus well over that particular zone.
Now, what's important about these two systems, David, right, is that, because a lot of people won't even know when those 2 systems are being engaged, right? So
Exactly.
the contrast detection mode is being used in DSLRs when you engage sort of the live view system. In most cases, this is not the case with mirrorless cameras, but this is the case with cameras or DSLRs that have a mirror on them, because what's happening is at that point the sensor is gathering kind of the video feed, if you will, and the focus is being done based on that video feed that's coming in. The real thing to keep in mind is that if you want the most accurate type and fastest type of autofocus system, you want to be using phase detection. And that is done typically with DSLRs when your mirror is down, when you're looking to the viewfinder, right?
Absolutely. And so, yeah, if you're shooting in video mode or in that live view mode on a DSLR, most of the time it's going to be using that contrast detection autofocus method, which is one reason why it's so much slower. Now, that's not necessarily
and less sensitive to light, right? It doesn't work as well in low light, right?
Exactly. It's definitely not going to work as well in low light either. And so the way the phase detection works, let's say this is a DSLR right here. So we have the light that's coming in through the lens. You can see this yellow pathway here. And then we have the mirror right here that's going to bounce the light up into this pentaprism, and it allows you to see through this viewfinder. At the same time, though, there's light that's coming in, and it's coming to the secondary mirror that bounces down to the autofocus sensor. And there's like a prism in here that will split the light or the image into 2 separate paths, and that's what allows the phase detection system to work. Now, there are limitations of this phase detection autofocus. One is it's not going to work as well in low light. Number 2, it may not focus well on low contrast or if your subject is very dark. It's just really hard for it to compare the 2 images side by side. The other limitation is you can't really put these autofocus points too close to the edge of the frame. And then fourth, it can be prone to errors at wide apertures. And this is something that we see quite often, I think more on the DSLR side. I haven't really seen it so much on the mirrorless side. But there's a function in these cameras menus that you may have seen. It's called lens micro adjustments. And what it does is it allows you to take a particular lens model and you can actually apply a manual autofocus adjustment to that lens to allow it to come into perfect focus every time with your phase detection system. And so I've had to do that with my DSLR, especially with like my telephoto lenses, where I'll go in and I'll set it on a tripod. I'll do some very careful work, setting that micro focus a little bit closer, a little further away, depending on which direction it needs to go. And then that allows me to get super sharp autofocus every time. But with my mirrorless cameras, I haven't had to do that. It seems like it works quite well just out of the gate. Has that been your experience, Juan?
Absolutely. With DSLRs, oftentimes I did have to adjust the micro focus adjustments on those cameras, but I really haven't had to do that at all with my mirrorless cameras. And I think part of it is because those autofocus sensors, those phase detect sensors, are really on top. There's like a little sheet on top of the sensor itself, and that's where the focusing is taking place. It's not taking place in some other area down in the bowels of the camera. And I think that's also part of the reason why inherent in the design of the mirrorless cameras, you end up with a much more accurate, faster responding, and more sensitive to low light, because the light beam is not sort of, in a way being split like you showed in the picture, right? Because the light beam, as it's coming in through the lens, is being split by that lens, the reflex mirror, part of it going to the eyepiece and then part of it going to the autofocus system. Whereas on the mirrorless, that's just not the case. The light is going right into the sensor itself.
Exactly. And if you want to understand more of the differences between like a DSLR and a mirrorless camera, we invite you to view one of our previous episodes specific to mirrorless cameras.
Right.
The other limitation, as Juan alluded to earlier too, with phase detection AF, is it often won't work in live view or in movie mode on many DSLR cameras. So there are different types of autofocus points. And the Sony was one of the first manufacturers to start putting phase detection autofocus pixels right on the sensor itself. And Canon and Nikon have now followed suit, and this technology is being deployed to both DSLR and mirrorless cameras. And there are various types of autofocus points. Your traditional autofocus sensor is going to be just a vertical sensor. And we call these just single point AF. And you can see them here in this little diagram. This is from a Canon 1DX. And then interspersed among these traditional autofocus points, we have these cross point areas. And so the way these work is like the vertical single point ones, they're basically just collecting one cross section of that image and comparing it against the same cross section. The cross point sensors, they're going to take two cross sections of that image and compare them against each other. And then there's even another point called a dual cross point, which is kind of what it shows right here, where you're actually taking three or more cross sections of that image and comparing them all against each other. Now, why would this be important? Well, the thing is, the autofocus system can be prone to errors depending on the direction the detail runs in your image. So let's say you're photographing something with a lot of vertical lines. Well, vertical lines aren't going to be able to resolve well to a vertical autofocus sensor. And so the cross-point sensor is going to be able to resolve those vertical lines much better and give you an accurate place to put that autofocus. And so the more cross-point sensors that your camera has, the more accurate the autofocus system is going to be. Conversely, the more expensive your camera is, it's also likely to have more of these cross-point sensors. So many of the entry-level cameras, they're going to be most primarily just these single-point vertical type sensors.
Yeah, that is a great point, because you notice that very, often with lower end cameras, or not just lower end cameras, but older cameras, right? That didn't have as many cross point sensors. Because if you had a lot of vertical elements in the scene, you'd be like, you were looking at this and you said, there's a lot of contrast here. Why can't the camera focus? And it's because it's trying to focus on these vertical elements with single point focus sensors. And this is the reason why, and a lot of the lower end cameras or older cameras, what they used to have was all single point sensors, and they would have like one cross point sensor in the center of the frame. And for us, a lot of us that we've been shooting for a while, or we're using lower end cameras, we always tended to rely mostly on that center focus point, because we knew that one would be the most sensitive and the most accurate. And this is the reason why nowadays most cameras have multiple cross-point sensors all over the frame. I think, for example, in a lot of the mirrorless, they're all cross-point. They're none of them are single point, correct?
I think it really depends on the manufacturer.
Well, that's true.
Yeah, I think you're right that the majority of autofocus sensors now are becoming the cross point.
Right.
And now that they're kind of putting them right on the sensor itself, it allows for more placement or better placement of those sensors.
Right. And also that's another issue too, is that, and I guess we're going to cover that a little bit more, is the coverage of those points across the frame as well is also a difference between the DSLRs and the mirrorless cameras.
Exactly. So if we look at this image right here, this is from a Canon 1DX. It's a DSLR camera. And you can see that these autofocus points are kind of constrained more towards the center part of this entire image frame. But now with like the mirrorless cameras and stuff, they can have these points all across the image frame, allowing for far better coverage. And so that alone, I think, is reason to kind of upgrade your gear to some of this latest technology, because it really can make a big difference in where you can capture your focus and how accurate that focus can be.
Right. And the other point to this is that, not only are they more accurate and faster, but they're also more sensitive to light when you have cross-point sensors, because you're doing that focus detection on more than one plane. So in this example here, on this image that you have, you can see the red parts of it are sensors that work in lower light, if you will.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And in low light, that's when the autofocus system is most prone to having an error, because it's just hard for it to resolve that image. But when you can compare it, like Juan says, with multiple planes, then the chances of an error occurring go down. So also in a lot of these menus, you have the option to set the camera to only use cross-point sensors. So there are more advanced features in the menu that you can also go in and set, especially if you have been having some autofocus problems.
Yeah, good point.
So moving on, talk a little bit about manual focus versus autofocus. So when I'm shooting from a tripod and I'm just shooting like a landscape or like a static subject, I have time to work and I know that focus is critical, I will prefer manual focus over autofocus. And the reason why is that focus is one of those things that you just cannot get wrong. If you don't focus and get it just right, then a lot of times you can't use that image later on. And so if I have the time and I know I can get it perfect, then yeah, I will switch my camera over to manual focus and I will focus manually. And autofocus, though, it works best when I'm hand holding or when time is of the essence. In other words, I need to work quickly. And autofocus also works well when everything in my scene is kind of essentially at infinity focus. Everything is pretty far away from the camera. Juan, has that kind of been how you've shot too, when it comes to landscapes and so forth?
Yeah, I mean, Yes, I mean, typically when I'm shooting on a tripod, I'm looking at setting the camera to manual focus. Sometimes I do, if like you said, if things are far enough away that I know I'm going to have, and we're going to talk about hyperfocal distance in a little bit near the end of the episode. I know that I'm hitting my hyperfocal. And for me in that situation, focus is not as critical. Maybe I'll then rely on the autofocus system by moving my focus sensor down to the area that I want most it to be in critical focus. But if I'm on a tripod and I have all the time in the world, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into manual focus, maybe go into live view if I'm shooting with a DSLR, or if I'm on a mirrorless camera, kind of zoom in on a specific area where I want my critical focus to be, and tweak that focus ring to be exactly where I want it to be. And then once I do that, once I have the focus exactly where I want it to be, most often I'll just flip that switch on the lens from autofocus to manual focus, so that I don't accidentally switch the focus by accident. Because it's easy to do, right? You hit that focus button on the camera, and then all of a sudden you didn't notice that your focus point changed, or your focus point on the scene changed, and then your image is out of focus, and you made a few shots and you didn't even realize it. So typically, if I'm shooting manual, I will make sure that that the focus switch is on manual on the lens itself, no matter how I got into manual focus mode. Because there are multiple ways to get into manual focus mode. You can, on a lot of cameras, you can do that right on the menus, or you can do it on the switch. So you got to make sure that as a fail safe, I always switch that on the lens.
Yes, and that's a really good point to make. And in the next episode, too, we'll talk a bit more about what we call back button focus, which is another way to avoid having that focus change on you when you don't want it to.
Right. That's crucial.
It's very crucial. And so, exactly, when I'm focusing manually, I like to zoom in digitally to kind of see that detail and be able to move that focus ring to achieve my critical focus. Now, we're not talking about zooming in with the lens. We're talking about zooming in on the back of that camera screen, or if you're using a mirrorless, with what you're seeing through the viewfinder. And so with a lot of these newer cameras now, when you switch them to manual focus and you turn that focus ring, it'll automatically kind of zoom you in. So you can kind of see that detail, and you can kind of use the joystick to move it around to the part of the scene that you want to concentrate on. And then a lot of times you can even hit the magnify glass again, or like the center button again, and it'll zoom you in even further. I usually like to go in quite a way so I can really see what's going on to get that detail perfectly sharp.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I wonder what your experience is the same as mine. A lot of these, especially with modern cameras or modern lenses that are fly-by-wire, right? There's not a mechanical connection between the ring and the actual motor inside, or the actual focusing mechanism. Sometimes I find that a little finicky to kind of tweak to get exactly right, but it's critical to do that. And I think that zooming in, like you're describing, you're zooming in, maybe not to the highest magnification, but maybe the second highest magnification helps a lot in achieving that critical focus.
Absolutely. And I find it works fine, with that wire type focus with some of those newer lenses and mirrorless systems. But what I find is kind of inaccurate, though, is the distance it tells you.
Oh, yeah, that is completely useless. Yeah.
5 meters. Yeah, you can't rely on that at all.
No.
Oftentimes I'm getting like infinity focus when it says I'm at 3 meters.
Right,
so
right.
That doesn't really make a lot of sense.
Right.
So don't go by the number. Just go by what you see at high magnification.
Yeah, and that's why doing that in the mirrorless is great, because you can do that right in the viewfinder, right? With DSLRs, you have to do it on the back screen, which can be challenging if there's, if you have light or whatnot. So using one of those loops kind of helps a lot in isolating that back screen to make sure you got that critical focus.
Oh, for sure. And yeah, when you're in bright light, it's so hard to see the back screen of the camera sometimes. So,
right.
And also people who have kind of poor eyesight, I definitely recommend getting like that loop so you can see better. Another technique I see people sometimes using in the field is called focus peaking. And that's where the camera will kind of overlay with a certain color the areas that it kind of deems to be in focus. And you can set it to different levels of sensitivity, and it works, differently with certain manufacturers. But what I found with focus peaking is that, yeah, it can be a handy guide. It can be useful when you're shooting video and you're trying to focus on the fly, that kind of thing. But overall, it's just not sensitive enough to tell me exactly where I'm achieving critical focus. It'll show areas that it says are in focus, but if I zoom in at higher magnification, I'll see that they're actually not in focus. And with high resolution cameras, you have to be so exact with this focus that I don't find focus peaking to be a very useful tool. And I actually tell most of my clients to turn it off unless they're like really into video work and that sort of thing.
I agree. I mean, I think the focus peaking gives you a general guide as to the area which is more or less in focus, but it doesn't give you that critical focus on that point in the scene. It's hard to tell sometimes.
Yes, exactly. Now, one thing I want to bring up that's really important for you DSLR shooters is that when you go to live view, it often will show you the stopped down aperture that you're shooting at. So if you're shooting at f11, the live view on that DSLR is actually showing you f11. Now at f11, you have a lot larger depth of field. And so if you're trying to achieve critical focus at a larger depth of field, it's going to be hard to know exactly where to put it because you're going to see a larger area that is in focus as you move that focus ring. So my recommendation is that for DSLR shooters using that live view, you're going to have to open your aperture wide open. If it's an f4 lens, you're going to go to f4. If it's an f2.8 lens, you're going to go to f2.8. And then once you're at wide open aperture, that's when you zoom in digitally, adjust your focus, get it just where it needs to be, and then you have to go back to your shooting aperture, whether that be f10, f14, f16, etc.
Yeah, that's going to let more light into that sensor, so it'll give you a much better view of the elements in the scene that you want to focus on. So that's a great tip. Especially if you have the camera set to show you the exposure, right? That's when the camera sets the aperture ring down to the aperture that you have it, so allowing less light to come in. So another great tip. Absolutely, that's great.
And I will say it does vary depending on manufacturer. And like for Canon cameras, for example, the live view is showing you the wide open aperture all the time unless you use that little depth of field preview button on the camera. Nikon's, it doesn't work that way. It shows you the stop down aperture. And so, it's just to be on the safe side, and unless you really know how your camera works, it's best just to focus at the wide open aperture and then stop down when you're ready to shoot. And again, that applies for DSLR users. Mirrorless cameras aren't going to have that same type of restriction.
Agreed.
So let's move on to focus modes. So we have single focus, which on Canon is called one-shot AF. On Nikon, they call it AF-S, which stands for single servo AF. Sony also uses the same nomenclature, AF-S. And you want to use that when you're shooting landscapes and stationary subjects. Continuous focus on a Canon is called AI servo. On Nikon and Sony, they call it AFC, where the C stands for continuous. And you want to use that for wildlife, people, moving subjects, and so forth. We don't recommend using continuous mode for landscapes, since the focus can jump around unexpectedly, and you may not even know it's jumping around. Then there's a third type of focus called hybrid focus. And on Canon, they call it auto-intelligent focus. On Nikon and Sony, they call it AFA, standing for auto. And I don't recommend that we ever use this mode because I don't like the camera making the decision for me when to jump between continuous focus to single shot focus. I want to make that decision myself, knowing exactly what I'm shooting. And the worst thing that can happen to you is that it jumps around unexpectedly when it shouldn't have. Let's say you're shooting a landscape and a bird flies into your scene. Well, I don't want it to suddenly start using continuous focus and going on that bird. No, I want it to focus exactly on that landscape where I want it set. So I say steer away from the hybrid modes and just go between single shot and continuous focus. And then know how to set those quickly on your camera. Another tip that I will throw out to people is on these cameras, especially these newer ones, they allow you to set user-defined modes on your little dial. So you can actually set up one mode that's more for a continuous type autofocus setting and another that's more for a single shot landscape type setting. And that'll allow you to switch between the modes faster as well.
I agree 100%. You know, those automatic modes, I've seen more people get bitten by those than anything else. You know, Murphy law being what it is, that camera's going to switch the wrong mode in the most inopportune times, and you don't want it to do that. You know, one of the ways that I actually use my system, and we'll talk a little bit more about this on the second episode, is that I leave my camera almost always on continuous mode, because I'm using back button focus. And with back button focus, you can actually control when autofocus engages more often than not. So that's something to consider. Whether, you know, if you had to stay in one mode, you know, kind of the default mode to be ready for any kind of situation, my recommendation would be to stay in continuous focus mode, and then switch over to single when you're going to be shooting from a tripod or a landscape scene or something like that.
Mm-hmm. Yep, great recommendation. So there's various zones that you can choose in your AF system. There's the wide zone, which kind of allows any focus point to kind of be selected depending on what the camera auto detects to be the best place to focus on. And, you know, if everything's kind of at infinity focus and far away, that's a fine mode to use. There's nothing wrong with that. But other times, these zones are going to be more useful for you, where you can choose to use like the focus points more like in the center of the frame, like right here, or you can use focus points on the left side, the right side, kind of depending where your subject is, or the top or the bottom. And, you know, these zones aren't going to be super accurate as far as like exactly what part it's going to select. It's going to the camera's still going to use some intelligence that it has built into it to determine which of those points it's going to activate. Now, these cameras also have the option to choose a single focus point, where you can go around and choose any one of these within your focus array. And then some of them even allow you to go further than that, where you can have it be just the pinpoint center of that focus sensor that's going to be activated. And so we're going to kind of talk about some situations where we do need that kind of pinpoint accuracy, and other times where it doesn't really matter. But a key skill that's important to have is that you want to be able to quickly change your AF modes and your AF points. And it's often best if you can do that without taking your eye away from the viewfinder, because that's going to interrupt your shooting, and you might miss critical moments in your photography.
Yeah, I mean, that is critical. I think that especially for action photography, being able to switch between different modes of layouts of focus points is super important, to be able to do that while you're still looking through the camera. If you take your eye off of that viewfinder and that subject is moving, by the time you put your eye on your viewfinder, it's going to take you a while to find that subject again. So you want to be able to learn, you know, just by moving and pointing. The nice thing about, you know, again, you know, and this is not a, you know, how good mirrorless cameras are, but that's one of the great things about mirrorless cameras is that you get confirmation in your viewfinder as to when you're changing those modes. That's not always the case with DSLRs. You gotta have to kind of know exactly which buttons to push and whatnot to change those points. It's a little harder to tell. So absolutely, that's a key skill to practice and get down, you know, kind of become second nature to your muscle memory on how to change those points. And choosing, you know, knowing which points to choose in which situations is also a critical skill. And we're going to give you a couple of examples of some of that, but we're going to talk a lot more about that on the second episode as well.
Yes. So here's an example. These bears were standing up in the tall grass. Now, you can see here that this foreground grass is out of focus. Now, if the autofocus system had picked up on this foreground grass, then there's no way that these bears could have been sharp, especially at the wide open aperture at which I was shooting this shot. And so this is an example, and this happens to me whether it be in landscape or in wildlife shots. If you have some something distracting or something in your near foreground that is easy for the autofocus system to pick up on, it can latch onto that, and then all of a sudden, your focus isn't quite where you wanted it to be, and your image may not be as sharp as it should be. And so this is something where it's really important to watch. If I had shot this and the autofocus system was picking up on this, then I might have to change it more to like a zone further up to capture the focus where I need it to be.
Especially if those grasses were moving. If you were using a pattern of focus points that included the bears and also the grasses, and all of a sudden the bears stood up like this, and they stood still or relatively still while these grasses were moving, oftentimes the camera will choose those grasses over the bears, right? And then you'll lose your shot completely. So that's why it's important to make sure you have the points exactly where you need them at all times.
Yes. And, if let's say you're using like that hybrid mode and you're shooting a landscape and it's like these grasses start blowing in the wind, well, that hybrid mode can quickly switch to continuous focus, latch onto that moving grass, and now all of a sudden the focus isn't where you needed it to be for your landscape shot.
Yeah, agreed. Absolutely.
All right. Here's a great example of a timber wolf. I'll let Juan speak to this one.
So this situation, you can imagine now if I was using any of the zone settings where I had a number of focus points in here, what the camera would pick up on would be those leaves, those beech leaves in the foreground, right? And what I'm trying to capture here is this timber wolf that it's peeking through this opening in the leaves, looking back at me. So I wanted to make sure that I'm using the smallest point on my sensor, or the smallest autofocus point, so I could put it right in that eye and use that little pinpoint autofocus sensor to put it right on that eye so it picks up and makes sure my eye is in focus. Is one of the basic rules of wildlife photography is eyes always need to be in focus. So I want to make sure that I am focusing on that eye and not on the leaves. Even though the distance between those leaves and the wolf is not that far, maybe 2 feet, maybe 3 feet, especially relatively to where I am. I'm about, 50 yards away, or maybe a little less than 50 yards away from the wolf. Being able to make sure that my focus is critical on that eye is important to me. So I want to make sure that I'm using the smallest sensor point to make sure that I'm picking up that eye. Very important.
Absolutely. And what Juan says is exactly true. You'd be amazed at how these like tiny little fluctuations in focus can make all the difference in the sharpness of your final image. And you may not think it matters that much, but when you compare files, you'll see how big of a difference it really does make. Here's another example of a scarlet macaw.
Yeah, so this scarlet macaw, this is kind of the opposite here. In this situation, I want to be using a wider array of autofocus sensors because as I'm following this bird in mid-flight, it's going to be hard for me to keep a single sensor on the face of that bird, right? So I want to make sure that I have a number of sensors to improve my chances that the autofocus stays on the bird as I'm panning and tracking that bird. However, I don't want to have a huge sensor area going on because, the camera may decide to focus on those palm fronds in the background because those have quite a bit of contrast and there's a little bit of wind, so they're moving as well. So those may confuse the camera if I have too many sensors active at any one time. So in a situation like this, I may want something like 6 focus points that kind of cover more of the bird and less of the background. If I had like a huge number of sensors or the entire screen or the entire viewfinder covered in sensors being active, the camera may not be as responsive in getting my subject in critical focus. So again, knowing when to choose that particular set of sensors is critical for the different situations you're going to be encountering. And we're going to be covering that a little bit more on the second part, on the second episode on autofocus systems.
Yeah. And then as a final example.
Yeah, and this is something similar here. There's a lot of stuff here that can be distracting to an autofocus system. This is a spider monkey sorry, not a spider monkey. This is a squirrel monkey in Costa Rica. And, again, I want to make sure that my eyes are in focus on this subject. And these monkeys are very small, and you compare them to the leaves. So I want to make sure, again, that I have a single focus point that I'm putting right on the eye of the monkey, so that none of the other parts of the scene confuse and grab my autofocus system, and thus giving me an image that's just slightly out of focus. And like David said before, you'd be amazed if the focus point was on a leaf or two in front of this monkey, those eyes would not be as crisp as they are here. They would still kind of see me focus, but not like this. Right now, they're absolutely razor sharp, and that's because my focus point is right in the eye of that monkey.
Yeah. So let's discuss depth of field. And, depth of field is one of those concepts that, again, is similar to autofocus. A lot of people don't have a good grasp of or a good understanding of. And, there's so many components that go into having a solid understanding of depth of field that I think, in a future episode, we'll go into some of those more advanced concepts. But to break things down and make it simple, from wherever you focus, 1/3 of your depth of field lies in front of where you focused, and 2/3 of your depth of field lies behind where you focus. If you look at this diagram right here, if I'm focusing on this point right here, then I have 1/3 in front, 2/3 behind. We call that the 1/3, 2/3 rule. And so when you're shooting landscapes, it makes sense to try to focus about 1/3 of the way distance-wise into your scene. And if you do that, you're going to kind of maximize the perceived depth of field you have throughout that entire landscape, from nearest foreground all the way to the mountains clear in the background. Now, let's say you're shooting wildlife, and let's say that your autofocus system gets confused and it accidentally focuses on the background. Well, let's think about the 1/3, 2/3 rule. If it focuses on the background, is there any way that your wildlife subject can actually be sharp? Pretty much no chance, because you only have 1/3 in front of where you focused for that depth of field to extend. And so accidentally focusing on the background is pure death to a wildlife shot. And so you have to really pay attention, as Juan said, what focus zone am I choosing? How constrained am I going to put those focus points in order to ensure that, I don't have focusing errors occurring where the camera gets confused between foreground and background.
I mean, the autofocus systems on the cameras, as amazing as they are, they're not foolproof. You need to manage them well, and you need to play to their strengths. And the best way to play to the strengths is by limiting what they see and what they look at to achieve focus. So that's why it's critical for you to understand the different focus modes in your camera. And I don't mean the different autofocus modes. I mean the different patterns of focus points that you can enable or disable in your camera, and use the appropriate one to make sure that you get your subjects in focus. Now, as David was just showing, the depth of field being 1/3 in front, 2/3 in the back, you're going to say, okay, but how deep do I have? How much space do I have? And that changes. There's a lot of rules that go into how deep your depth of field is. And we're going to talk, like David said, on a future episode on depth of field, because there's a lot of variables that go into determining how deep your depth of field is for any type of situation. So, we're going to touch on it a little bit here, but we're going to go more in depth on this, because this is a subject that, in my experience, a lot of people don't have a good grasp on.
Yes, agreed. So let's take this shot from White Pocket. This was a crazy monsoon storm. The light was just breaking through. And obviously, when you're in a situation like this, you have to work quickly, because light like this sometimes doesn't last very long.
Usually, sometimes seconds, right?
Yeah, sometimes even seconds. So, I set up my tripod. I was probably about kneeling height here for this shot. I was shooting around f11 to try to kind of maximize that depth of field. And I had to, there wasn't time to do things like focus stacking, things like that. I had to just focus at one point in this shot and I had to maximize the depth of field as a result of where I chose to focus. So let's say I just used the wide array autofocus. Well, chances are it would probably focus on this background hill here because that's going to have the maximum contrast, especially when juxtaposed against this dramatic sky. Well, if I were to focus back here, it's unlikely I would have enough depth of field extending out in front of that to render these foreground stripes to be sharp. In fact, they would probably be blurry. So instead, I want to think about that 1/3, 2/3 rule and focus like that 1/3 of the way distance-wise into my scene. In other words, where I say focus here. And doing that, I was able to get tack sharp results from nearest foreground all the way into my background. Now, a lot of these newer cameras now, they have touch screen focus. Yeah, you can turn that on or off, depending on your preferences. But this can also make it really fast. Because all I would have to do is go on my camera screen, touch in this red area right here, and it'll focus right on that spot. And then I don't have to worry about trying to change points or change zones or things like that. It can make it much more seamless and more fluid.
Right. And so, and this, I'm giving you a segue here for the next section is, right, I focus 1/3 into the scene. How can I be sure that my background is also going to be in focus if I'm focusing into 1/3 of the scene?
And that's a really good point because let's say I have my foreground that's really, really close. Well, I might not be able to get everything in focus in one shot if it's super close. And we're going to talk a little bit about, a concept called hyperfocal distance and what that means. And before we kind of get into the specifics of hyperfocal, I'll have Juan kind of speak to this image and why he chose to focus where he did.
Well, this again is similar to what David just showed here. I wanted to show this sort of grandiose scene of the very sweet light hitting this part of Lamar Valley. With bison in the foreground. We kind of waited here for quite a while to get this bison in the foreground with this sort of twisted cottonwood that's in the background. And a lot of people would say, I want the whole landscape to be in focus. In this situation, a lot of folks would think about focusing on the tree because that's one of the most prominent parts of the scene. But knowing that my depth of field, I'm going to have a lot more depth of field to the background than it is to the foreground, meaning I have 2/3 to the back versus 1/3 to the front. I'm going to be focused here on my bison because I know that then my focus will carry to the background and carry over to the trees as well as to my to the landscape, the mountains in the background because of this concept called hyperfocal distance, which David is going to tell us a little bit about.
We'll come back to this one here. So hyperfocal distance is the optimal place to focus to maximize your depth of field. And the definition of it is, if you focus at that hyperfocal point, everything from half the hyperfocal distance all the way back to infinity is going to be sharp. And it can be calculated based on your camera you're using, your focal length, and the aperture you're shooting at. And there's apps out there like PhotoPills that can calculate that for you automatically. Now, in practice, it isn't always easy to judge distance, especially when you're in the field, you're working quickly, and so forth. And the scale on the focus ring is rarely accurate. And, I've always had better results just kind of thinking about the 1/3, 2/3 rule, rather than trying to be so fixated on exact numbers. Now, understanding these numbers and how they work and understanding the concepts behind them is really important. So here's a little diagram showing exactly how it works. We have this guy that's shooting here. His hyperfocal distance, based on the focal length he's at, was determined to be right here. And so at half that hyperfocal distance, we have this flower. Everything between the log and up to the flower can be considered sharp. But anything closer to him than this flower is going to be unsharp. Everything from the hyperfocal distance all the way back to infinity is going to be sharp. So if you can kind of nail that focus at that hyperfocal distance, then you're going to have the maximum depth of field in that shot. Now, here's a hyperfocal table that I just pulled a screenshot off of PhotoPills. You just come in, you set your camera up here, you look at the aperture that you want to shoot at, and you look at the focal length over here. And then you can kind of go over and it'll tell you what this hyperfocal distance will be. Now, I like to pay attention more to trends rather than to specific numbers. So as we increase the focal length here, going from like 35 millimeters on up to like 80 millimeters, look what happens to the hyperfocal distance. It gets further and further away, meaning that the more I zoom in, the harder it will be to have a close foreground element that can also be rendered sharp along with the background. So you're going to have a much larger depth of field if you're shooting a wider lens than you are if you're shooting a more telephoto lens. Let's also look at the aperture here. You know, as I start to stop this lens down from like f10 over to f14, you can see that the hyperfocal distance becomes smaller. In other words, I can now have things closer to me in my foreground that can still be sharp than if I had the lens wider open.
One thing that's important looking at this table is that there are three factors that affect that hyperfocal distance, right? One is your sensor size, which here is represented by the camera, because in PhotoPills, for example, you can choose your camera and it has a database of all the sensor sizes for all the cameras. And, you know, even though we're talking about full frame cameras, not all sensors are exactly the same size. They may vary a tiny bit. So I guess in an effort to be complete, they have a database of camera sensor sizes. So you have sensor size, you have your f-stop, and then you have your focal length. And that combination of those three will then give you what that hyperfocal distance is. And what's important is to know, I mean, the thing is to be, as David mentioned before, sometimes it's hard to judge distances. I'm notoriously bad at just judging distances by just looking at something. But to get the idea, like you said, look at the trend. Understand that if this subject that's in front of me is 10 feet away and I am shooting at, 35 millimeters, well, I need to be at least f11 in order to achieve focus on my background, on that mountains out near infinity, right? So again, it's by looking at that trend. If I go to f13, it gives me, I can shoot my subject even a little closer if I wanted to make it bigger in the scene. So to speak. So I hope that helps in understanding hyperfocal distance. And again, this is not something you need to memorize. Some people like print these and they keep it inside their bags or they try to memorize it or whatnot. There's no need to do that. You can use an app, like David said, like PhotoPills that has this built into it, so you can carry it in your pocket all the time. Or just keep in mind, the trend, right? Is that if you're shooting at wide angle, 24 or less, you need to be at f11, and you know that your subject can then be at 10 feet. That's going to be roughly your hyperfocal distance. So if you kind of roughly keep this in mind, you can, again, we're shooting digital, right? So you can actually take a shot when you're there and confirm by looking at the image, zooming in and looking to make sure that all the elements are in focus as you intended. So it's not, I see people carrying these charts, hyperfocal charts, or memorizing them or whatnot. Sure, if you want to do that, that's fine, but it's not something you need to do. I know it can be a little intimidating to people who are not necessarily numbers, or that are numbers challenged or technically challenged in that respect.
Absolutely. And I couldn't agree more. So here's an example of a landscape shot. Yeah, using my knowledge of kind of the hyperfocal trends, I took this shot at like 70 millimeter. And so I knew that I needed to have things that were further away in my scene to be able to get everything in a single shot scenario. And so I was able to focus right here, knowing that this was right around like 10 meters away. And that's going to be kind of my hyperfocal distance. By focusing here, then even this background feature and even what was back behind this is all going to be sharp. And indeed it was. And I could shoot that at like f10, f11, and it all came out nicely. But as Juan said, the most important thing you can do to shooting digitally, if you're concerned, if you're getting it right, is just zoom in and look at the actual pixels of the shot you took. Does everything look sharp from your foreground all the way into your background? If so, you're done. If it doesn't look sharp, you notice like the foreground looks soft or the background looks soft, then that's the time to kind of readjust where you set that focus.
Yeah, I mean, this used to be, like we said earlier, this used to be important when you were out there shooting with film because you couldn't see the results right away. But nowadays, it's not as important. I've always wondered that why don't the camera manufacturers? I mean, they could put an overlay right in your viewfinder for mirrorless to show you where the hyperfocal distance is. But then again, I don't think it'd be all that accurate because if they can't keep the numbers on the distance on the focus scale accurate, I wouldn't trust any hyperfocal stuff that they showed me on the screen anyways.
Yeah, same with focus peaking,
Right.
It sounds great in theory, but, in practice, it just isn't accurate enough.
Right.
Shooting at night is another time when nailing that hyperfocal distance is really important. And, in this kind of shot, a lot of times you might be tempted to try to focus over here on the person. But from my knowledge of hyperfocal distance, knowing that I'm shooting this at a very wide angle, and I'm shooting it wide open with the lens, it's going to put my hyperfocal distance a bit closer. And so instead of focusing on the person, I chose to focus right about here on the edge of the ice in the water. And then I took the shot and I actually verified that, yeah, the stars, everything looks sharp. Everything looks sharp even in this closer foreground. I was able to achieve all that in a single shot type scenario.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people, when they look at a scene like this, their temptation would be to focus on the person that's out there, which, to make him nice and sharp, because that's one of the primary elements of the scene, right? But if they did that, all this foreground stuff closest to you would be so out of focus, it'd be actually distracting.
Yes.
So by using that hyperfocal distance, you can actually make sure that not only is your primary subject in focus, but all the supporting elements in the scene are also in focus.
Absolutely. So anyways, we hope that these concepts that we kind of covered in this episode were useful and helpful to understanding how autofocus works, a little primer behind depth of field and how we achieve the best depth of field in images. And we're excited to bring you the next episode where we're going to go even more in depth and talk about how you become a master of achieving good focus, especially with action and moving type of shots.
Absolutely. Well, folks, thank you for joining us once again on the Images in Focus show. We hope that you got something out of this and you enjoyed it. And we love to hear from you. So make sure to send us questions or any kind of information at info@imagesinfocus.photo, or join us on our Facebook group and post any questions you may have there, or if you have suggestions for future topics for the show. Until next time, take care, folks.
Thank you.